All right, we have just been listening to the lawyers who represent Constable Daniel Monsian reacting to the not guilty verdict today. It is our breaking news this hour. I want to bring in criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind. He's joining me from Toronto. Ari, so this officer has been cleared. We just heard from his lawyers there that he is relieved. They're speaking on behalf of the constable, that he's relieved and he's looking forward to returning to work. Let me begin by getting your reaction. Not guilty on all charges.
Marcia, in the 10 o'clock hour when we first spoke, I predicted it. This was a case that even though it took 4 to 7 weeks of witnesses, I can tell you that this was a case that absolutely looked to not meet the standard test in a court. Now, what does that mean? The judge has to take away passion. The judge has to take away protest. The judge has to take away the interest of certain communities that want to see a conviction despite the evidence. And you saw the lawyer right there push back heavily, very, very heavily on the idea that this was a brutal beating. So I'm not surprised at all. And if you look at the videotape, just the 2-3 minutes, while it looks awful, there was nothing that jumped out as lawful. And remember, the Crown's own pathologist, this is important. The Crown's own pathologist said he couldn't determine until he changed his mind whether this was an accident or homicide. That's important. And then said that Mr. Abdi could have died at any time given the constellation of issues. So even though this is a 100-page decision, and people should read it, as the lawyers just said, this was not complicated, that in my view, this didn't come close to proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and that video was intended, I believe, by the Crown to be their ace in the hole, that it was going to help support their case, but it didn't turn out to be that way, Ari.
No, and you make that point very fairly, and you see again where the lawyer pushed back at another reporter asking a question about a brutal beating. Watch the 2 minutes. It looks awful. There's no doubt about it. But you have to look at this in the context of a police officer. Again, the small detail that the judge pointed out that the officer's lawyers just advised everybody on in their quick press conference was they had the radio transmissions of what the officer was told when they got there. And let me make this point, because there's going to be a lot of unrest in Ottawa today. There's no doubt there'll be a big apology tour. The chief of police will have to calm tensions. But there's a bigger point here that's often missed. And Judge Kelly was very, very live to it. There are many people who go through the criminal justice system, and sometimes we say the term presumed innocent. Just because Twitter wants an officer to be convicted, just because certain communities think an officer should be convicted who don't have all the evidence, how does it serve any Canadian, particularly in racialized communities, that we keep lowering our standards to Twitter standards to convict people? The courts need to be the bastion to say, we're not looking to win a popularity contest. We're not looking to be beloved, but we are looking to do right in the system, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if something looks awful, but remains lawful, to quote an officer in that case, we're not going to lower the standards just because there could be political unrest or upset.
Well, I will just say not everyone will look at this and say that this is just, that this is right, that justice was not served. I do want to ask you lastly, though, and the lawyers were asked about this as well. We're 4 years since this incident took place, and the conversation has changed, and there is a lot of talk about police reform and de-escalation when officers arrive at the scene. Ari, do you think that that will create some change, spark some change here?
I think it always tends to. I think it hopes to, as we were talking about earlier, the James Forcillo Sammy-Atim, the mentally ill young man on the streetcar in Toronto, where an officer killed him, blew him away for, in my view, no reason. These are issues where we have to get rid of the anti-police, pro-police rhetoric and just figure out, when you're dealing with somebody like that, who's mentally ill, unarrestable, fighting back, not willing to comply with demands. We see some kernels of this in the United States where all of a sudden where an officer says you're under arrest becomes a choice. For mentally ill people, it's often not a choice. So as long as the powers that be don't go down this I hate police, I love police road, but figure out for mentally ill people, what is a better way to quiet them? What is a better way to subdue them? Now, I'm not talking about this case, but I do think change comes incrementally. I think the idea that change happens with a snap of the fingers is just false. And I think sometimes, and this won't be a popular statement, but I don't care. Sometimes people forget that it's not an easy job to be a police officer. And I'm a criminal defense lawyer who goes after police officers every day. Sometimes we need to look back and say, is this a criminal case? Is this somebody who committed manslaughter? Or is this a litmus test and a perfect example for changing the system for the better? Leave aside race, religion, and creed, but for mentally ill people who just may not be processing police commands the way you and I would when we're told to stop and get on the ground.
Ari Goldkind, thank you so much for being part of our coverage of this story this morning. Really appreciate seeing you.
Thank you.